To Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, June 21st. Happy summer solstice. It's raining outside in Washington, D.C., so it doesn't feel like the start of summer, but it is. It is the start of summer with the longest day of the year. And Broadband Breakfast, we are all about better broadband, better lives, making sure people can get higher capacity broadband and that it gets used for purposes that enable connectivity and progress and opportunity for people's lives. We're going to be talking today about middle mile, and we'll define that and discuss it. Lots to talk about. Before I turn to our panel, though, I want to say a couple of quick things by way of welcome and introduction for those of you who haven't been on one of our programs. Welcome. We're grateful to have you on these programs. We do this every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. We've been doing it since the pandemic started, so 3 1/4 years ago, every Wednesday. And this again is trying to build and bring the community together around the infrastructure and the use of the infrastructure. So we obviously we're very, very focused on the work of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which has just 5 days ago awarded $930 million in middle mile grants. But it really is just a kind of a taste testing or an early indication of the $42.5 billion that will be kind of kicked off in earnest in, I think, 9 days' time. The NTIA has set a deadline for themselves of June 30th to announce the amounts of funding under the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program. That those funds, of course, follow a rather elaborate process, which we won't go into too much detail today, but just to say that NTIA's work in the middle mile cannot be viewed in isolation to the broader broadband project. And by the same token, I would argue that we can't even look at broadband infrastructure in isolation. Broadband Breakfast, as a publisher of news and events around broadband infrastructure, big tech, and broadband's adoption use, we are doing our next full day conference on a very important topic. It's called the Made in America Summit. It's going to be happening less than a week from today on June 27th here in Washington, D.C. And let me just say a word or two about this. After I finish this intro, I'll put the link to it on the chat window for those of you who are in Zoom. Those of you who are in the other platforms, you can visit broadbandbreakfast.com/MIAS for Made in America Summit. And just a bit about the summit, as this is the last live online before the summit begins. We're going to be considering in a holistic way these 3 federal funding efforts that link together in some interesting ways. For example, we're talking about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is the funding source for these broadband infrastructure deployments. We'll also be talking about the CHIPS and Science Act, passed in July of last year. The CHIPS and Science Act, we talked about our last Wednesday's talk, provides at least $280 billion for the chip making industry in an effort to revive and bring American production of semiconductors back up. Used to be at 40% of global capacity. Now it's at 12% of global capacity. And CHIPS and Science Act is trying to pump that up, in part because of some of the geopolitical competition America experiences vis-a-vis China. And then the third large federal funding piece is I hate the name, Inflation Reduction Act. It's clearly a political stop. It doesn't even achieve its purpose. It's about green energy, right? And so the green energy provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, passed in August of last year, that puts another $400 billion or more into green energy. And so we're going to be talking about the ways energy and internet infrastructure come together. We're going to talk obviously about semiconductor manufacturing, the US-Chinese tech race, about challenges to reorienting America's supply chain, which is a huge issue for those of you who are here in this conversation. And I know I've spoken to several of you who are panelists and others about why the Buy America provisions are of concern. This Made in America Summit, we're going to consider this holistically, right? So like, could America change its supply chain? Could America change its reliance on overseas chip making and other products? And then, of course, making cleaner energy and enhancing the green industry, right? And so we've got 4 panels. The first panel, Scaling Up the Smart Grid, is going to be talking about rights of way issues for energy and for broadband. And that panel will be moderated by Robert Glicksman, a professor of environmental law at George Washington University. The second panel on domestic manufacturing, the chips race. We got, again, great group of panelists. It'll be moderated by Rishi Iyengar, the global technology reporter at Foreign Policy magazine and website. Panel 3, the future of Buy America requirements. That'll be moderated by yours truly, focused on this issue at Broadband Breakfast. And so we're bringing together people who will talk about what the waiver situation is like, what we can expect, how soon we can expect it. And then our fourth panel, Creating an American Green Energy Industry, that will be moderated by Julian Spector of Canary Media. So if you're interested in at least even just one of these 4 topics or holistically, I invite you to look at the page for this event and consider attending. We at this moment, we are not planning to live stream it. However, we will be making recordings of it available for Broadband Breakfast Club members. Registration for the Made in America Summit is $249 for the whole day event. You also get breakfast and wonderful barbecue lunch. And we're going to be at Samsung's Executive Briefing Center, which is at 700 Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast, just on Capitol Hill in their Eastern Market. And 249 regular tickets. If you are an internet service provider or a nonprofit or government, you can purchase a registration for $99. And best of all, if you are a member of the Broadband Breakfast Club, which is our premium product, $99 a month, you get an exclusive report. This past month was on the CHIPS and Science Act report, so we dug deeply into this. You can register to attend for only $49 for being a member of the Broadband Breakfast Club. So we hope you'll consider this. Again, I'm going to put the link in to the Zoom, and it'll be available on Broadband Breakfast for you to attend the Made in America Summit. So let's turn now, give a quick thanks to our sponsors that enable us to do the programming that we do every Wednesday for free for each of you to attend and learn a little bit about. The sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast include Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Comcast, Nokia, the ComLaw Group, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Michael Baker International, Bitstream Communications, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. Thank you to our sponsors for supporting our programming. All right, let's open it up now to our 4 panelists. We're very excited to have each of you. Some of you are return visitors and some welcome to your first Broadband Breakfast. I'm going to introduce them all briefly here, and then they'll go in that order. First off, we will hear from Josh Broder. Josh is the CEO of Tilson, and Tilson is a national leader in telecom consulting, design, and build services. And he's grown Tilson from less than 10 employees to 1,200 employees. So really a great success story there. And Josh, thank you for being with us in New Orleans at the Broadband Breakfast for Lunch event we had at ConnectX, the trade show for the Wireless Infrastructure Association. And it was about the middle mile. So maybe some of those points will come up in our discussion. So Josh, welcome. Look forward to you telling us a little bit about the great things Tilson's involved in on the middle mile side. Following Josh, we're going to hear from Mark Goldstein. Mark chairs the Arizona Telecom and Information Council and is president of the International Research Center and provides consulting, custom research, and strategic support for entities in the broadband space. I always think of him as associated with Arizona, and our association goes back to the state broadband initiative days, where I was the Illinois state broadband officer, and Mark worked very closely in the Arizona office there. So Mark, we're so happy you can come and report on your successes. Congratulations on 2 victories that I'm sure you'll tell us a little bit about just now. And welcome as again, return visitor here. We are so excited to welcome Matt Leach to the discussion. We've done a little back and forthing with Matt and Mike, but the bottom line is Matt is the public sector strategic account manager at FiberLight, and FiberLight is, of course, a provider of fiber, helps customers design, engineer, build, and optimize their fiber optic networks. So, Matt, we look forward to hearing more about some of the things that FiberLight is doing and has been doing and wants to continue doing. And I'm sure you'll tell us more about your experiences there. And, actually, I'm going to mention one more quick point before I lead to our last guest, which is that, and we talked about this at our event in New Orleans, even though, quote unquote, only 1 billion was awarded, actually only 930 million. So there's still more that will be awarded. And there will be opportunities for last mile projects funded under the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program to also include middle mile components. So again, I hope all of our panelists will weigh in on that point too as we go through. All right. And then last but not least is Brent Legg. Brent is the Executive Vice President for Government Affairs at Connected Nation, a national nonprofit that works at the intersection of technology, politics, and public policy. And Brent has been leading Connected Nation's joint venture to establish carrier-neutral internet exchange points in unserved markets across the United States. So very excited. Hopefully you'll talk a lot about this, Brent. I really look forward to hearing more about these IXP facilities and what Connected Nation does, how kind of a national nonprofit factors into this space. Brent and I also go back to the days of the State Broadband Initiative where you worked on. What states did you work on, Brent?
We were in 12 states, actually,
Right.
plus Puerto Rico. So we did have the opportunity to work with you in Illinois for a bit.
Did you work to any one particular state or another, or just kind of you were all globally across all the states?
Well, we had staff in multiple states. My job was sort of to maintain relationships with those stakeholders.
Got it. All right. Well, didn't mean to cut the cue there. We'll come to you, Brent, and you can tell us all about the work you are doing in the middle mile deployment. So with that, let's turn it over to our first panelist. Josh, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Drew, and thanks everybody for logging in to view here. I'm the CEO of Tilson, which is on a mission to build America's information infrastructure, and we do that as consultants, helping state and territorial governments run their broadband programs, particularly their broadband subsidy programs, and we do it as design builders of networks as well, usually in other states. In the current sort of large federal funding environment that we're in, we're advising on a number of the ARPA and BEAD funded projects for these state and territorial governments. I think today we're in something like 15 of those jurisdictions, and would expect that as states select their consulting partners, there may be a few more before the cycle is over. And we were really delighted to see that in the middle mile program, actually 3 of our clients receive support. And one of the things that characterizes the sort of cohort of awardees here in the middle mile projects are the fact that there are both private and public instrumentalities that receive grants. And really for the first time in these large, federal stimulus cycles, we've also seen some power companies show up. And so one of the core sort of bedrock foundational aspects of the grant program was that there was a lot of eligible entities And so we were really pleased to see some that we were working with be awarded, but also really pleased to see that industry and utilities were able to successfully participate.
That's a great point about the mix of entities that won awards, and we'll talk a little more about this just now. But thanks for those brief remarks, for staying on time. Let's turn it over to you, Mark, to tell us a little bit about your work in this program.
Certainly. Thanks, Drew, and all. Welcome. Good to be back on Broadband Breakfast. I'm usually in the audience, but occasionally front and center. So I led 3 grant efforts, one under my company, International Research Center, and 2 as a contractor to a company called Grant Management Associates, and led teams for their clients on 2 others. 2 of those 3 were winners, including the largest grant. I'll bring up a small deck in a minute so that I can show you the 2 winning projects that I led the efforts on. But I wanted to say a few things about the program. So it was 7.5x oversubscribed by dollars, with only 35 of 260 applications awarded so far. With 50 million left, there's probably room for another 2 or 3 to yet be brought to bear. But interestingly, the metrics for this grant were different than any I had faced before. There was a 2-tier evaluation system, merit review on a 100-point scale, and then programmatic review that had multipliers. I called it the bonus round, up to eight multipliers, 10% each. So in the end, there was a 180-point total. But 1 or 2 criteria in there were interesting. The matching percentage on grants is usually set at a minimum, and then exceeding that's kind of a tiebreaker, but not a scoring metric. In this grant, there were 15 of the 100 points available. You had a minimum 30% match, gave you 5 points, 41% gave you 10 points, and 50% or more gave you 15 points baseline times your multiplier. And I did the math, and from what NTIA has announced is the overall match, that overall match from providers was 47.7%, which to me that says most of the awards went to people offering a 50% match, some to 40% match, and I'd have to go through the 35 to see if any at a 30% minimum match even made it. Also, I have to congratulate Sarah Blue and her team. They were extraordinary, not just webinars and email responses, but 12 office hours that were really just open discussions. And that was an extraordinary opportunity. And I will talk briefly about in-kind matching, but I have to say that NTIA didn't really have much precedent for how that would work, and had to be kind of invented on the fly. So they were also quite, I'm trying to get to a, nope, wrong. Okay, I lost it. Sorry. I'm going to unshare. Sorry. Oh, shit. Okay, so the first project.
It's tricky to navigate, but Mark, yeah, take your time to get to what you want to.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to fix my PowerPoint. Close that, sorry. Okay, it's back. I won't try to do what I did again. I'll keep it less than full screen. Sorry about that. Here we go. So the first project was for Quintillion, which is in Alaska. And there it is. And this is the award announcement. It was $89 million, the largest award in the program. But more importantly, I want to show the map. So very few people realize how vast Alaska is. It's 2.5 times the size of Texas, and from east to west is as wide as the continental United States in total. And the only fiber that exists today is the competitive fiber in green in this quadrant and below, and my client Quintillion's red fiber going up to the Prudhoe Bay and around a Nome. So they have a one-ended network, and this grant gives them 730 sea miles, 250 terrestrial and small water crossing miles, and completes their network as a resilient loop. I don't think anyone could have made a better national security argument on a broadband middle mile grant than they were able to, looking at this vast space. This is Russia over here on the left. There's actually been incursions from Russia to St. Lawrence Island over here. But just to, in the terms of brevity, let me talk briefly about their strategy for in-kind matching. Of the 25 million, 23 was in cash, but 22 million was a valuation put on the backhaul provided by this red fiber. It's lit at a terabyte, 10 lambdas of 100 gigabits per second each, and they dedicated one to backhaul for the Orange network segment. We valued it. The original network cost 2017 was 291 million. The depreciated value at the time of the grant was 221 million. And we claimed a $22 million in-kind value, which with some work, NTIA accepted. What they required was a fair market valuation study that says that the price per for 100 gigabit per second circuit was under market price for that route and that capacity over the 25-year life of the project. So again, I've never seen in-kind valuations done on existing network like this. And moving forward, I'll say one thing. They required an open access interconnect policy. I'm sure everyone on the panel had to write one. It wasn't easy. And the word in perpetuity, a single word, gave many of us heartache in debating what that meant and getting legal counsel and committing to things in perpetuity. You know, these aren't 1,000-year networks. And so some angst dealing with that, and those had to be published on your website prior to your application, basically adopted as a policy. The other grant that was a win for me was in Iowa for an energy company. I'm glad someone mentioned the energy company Entries, Mid-American Energy. They are a division of Berkshire Hathaway Energy, Warren Buffett. And so a well-funded and cash-rich, they did a 50% match, which I'm sure helped them. They also committed to a 2-year timeline. The actual number of points for committing to 2 years wasn't known, but I'm guessing in the 2 to 3 point range. It was part of one of the criteria. And in their case, and just to finish up with this, the in-kind effort for them was they asked for the money to build and operate a 775-mile new network, right? Dedicating 24 strands to internal command and control, 72 strands to the marketplace, open access. But they also had 2,000 miles of existing proprietary internal fiber. And what they did is offered 1,365 miles of it they felt were appropriate and practical, 24 strands on that to the open access market. So we're able to value 24 strands for 1,365 miles at about a $25 million valuation, and successfully support that through the NTIA grant process, which I think has legs under the grid proposal in Congress for potential utility awards in the future that would involve middle mile capacity. The bringing of existing proprietary capacity to the open access market now has, at least in one of my applications, maybe others, precedent for being able to value that as an in-kind resource. That's it. Sorry if I went long.
Mark, no, you obviously went long, but I think everyone will agree that was well worth it to get into that detail and to give us that perspective. That will be a great discussion point when we get to the discussion. Let's turn now to Matt Leach. Take it away.
Hey, no, it was great to hear about those projects. It's really exciting to see what everybody else is doing. So I'm Matt Leach, and just a quick clarification on FiberLight. So we're actually a network operator, and I think the description kind of came through more as we do a lot of customized build for our clients. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you for clarifying that, Matt.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Yep. And so, it was really exciting what the NTIA did. It's in my career, the first time I've seen something focused on middle mile like this. So I hope that we see more, because that's really exciting for, a company that has 18,000 miles of middle mile fiber in 5 different states. We want to continue to kind of grow our grant efforts. And so going after stuff like this is important to us. And especially the partnerships, I think, is, one of the biggest things that we saw in this grant that's really starting to be highlighted. When BEAD comes out, that's what we expect to kind of continue to grow that, the effort of getting out there, engaging with the communities. I think that is crucial for the success of all these projects, rather than just providers going out there and trying to grab as much money as they can. I think it shows really kind of a good faith effort that this project that we're going after and expecting to get money for, we're going to do right by the community and deploy as best as we can and efficiently, and make sure everybody's taken care of. So we did have several middle mile grants that we did so far unsuccessful. Congratulations to everybody else on the call that has done, has had some successful grants, and I believe probably 30 other people out there who aren't on the call that had wins. So congratulations to all of them as well.
Thank you, Matt, and appreciate your being on the call. Obviously, we set this up before the awards were announced, so yeah. a little bit of a roll of the dice. But again, as I stated earlier, well, and as Mark said earlier, there's still another looks like 70 million based on the raw numbers, but maybe that's slightly lower, still to be awarded, and there is quite likely the possibility that middle mile projects are integrated with last mile projects. So Brent, let's turn it over to you for your thoughts on this this effort and what Connected Nation is doing in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. My first time on Broadband Breakfast, so thanks for having me, Drew. I'm going to share my screen just quickly to go over our 2 middle mile projects. One of which was awarded, one of which was not awarded, or at least not awarded yet. The first of which is a 682 mile long open access middle mile fiber network extending from Seward County Community College and Garden City Community College in western Kansas through Wichita. Specifically through the internet exchange point that we're developing on Wichita State University's campus, over to Pittsburgh State University on the eastern side of Kansas, and then up to Kansas City to 1102 Grand Boulevard, where the Kansas City Internet Exchange is located. The network consists of a as I said, a 682 mile long open access system with 7 microducts inside a larger sheath. One of those will be open access dark fiber provided by one of the partners in this grant. So we partnered with the Kansas Department of Transportation, the Kansas Department of Commerce, CANREN, which is the Research and Education Network in Kansas, and then a local, both transport and local ISP company called Ideatech. So Ideatech will operate, one of the microducts will be open access dark fiber. The 2 of the microducts will be for the Kansas Department of Transportation. And then 4 of the microducts will be essentially vacant and available on an open access basis to allow for future fiber deployments along this route. Connected Nations' role in this is that we will be the administrator of the open access portion of the 4 microducts. So essentially all of the ducts, all the microducts, plus the manholes, handholds, et cetera, all of the real estate associated with this project. So it's really, as far as we know, the first of its kind like this that has 3 sort of distinct partners involved, which will be a fantastic network once it's finally built to support other future network builds under BEAD, right? So we're super excited to have this getting ready to be kicked off because it will have a material impact on many of the rural counties in southern Kansas. Our second grant application, which did not win, or at least did not yet win, was a $35.5 million grant application to establish new carrier-neutral internet exchange points on 4 university campuses and with the city of Albuquerque on the fence line of Kirtland Air Force Base. So we launched an initiative about 4 years ago and to build new carrier-neutral IXPs in markets that do not have them. There are 14 states and 3 U.S. territories in the U.S. that have no neutral interconnection facility at all. And that's simply not going to be good enough as we think about the future evolution of the internet, the importance of latency reduction, how many applications are being developed for sub 10 or sub 8 millisecond latency. We need to create more neutral points of interconnection across the country. Having them only be in essentially 57 large metropolitan cities just simply isn't going to sustain the future growth of the internet. So our application involved essentially a partnership with the 4 universities and the city of Albuquerque that you see here on the screen. Each of those entities donated an in-kind contribution of 2 acres of land under a 40-year ground lease. The city of Albuquerque actually contributed $1.8 million in cash above that. And then we had great support from each of these entities, as well as Kirtland Air Force Base, because of the situation regarding the current carrier hotel in Albuquerque, which I won't get into, but it was concerning to the Air Force. So unfortunately, this application was not awarded, but we are going to continue to be working with last mile ISP partners to pursue BEAD funding for each of these sites under the BEAD program, under the middle mile provisions of the BEAD program. So happy to get into that further. I've got a couple of other slides, but I won't, for the sake of time. Drew, I'll turn it back to you, and hopefully we can get into some questions about this and what we're doing more broadly on the IXP front.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and roll back to our view with all of us. Great introductions. Thank you to each of you, and congratulations to the winners. Let's start off with 2 questions, and these were both teed up by Mark. And I want to invite our audience. We got a great audience here today. whether you're on Zoom or on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, you can ask your question, and hopefully we'll be able to get them. And two that I'm going to start off with are the match numbers. Okay, like what are we seeing? What do we know from that? The last link that I've put in the chat window is to an article that we posted on Broadband Breakfast on Friday after we just, did a quick analysis of this, and the bottom of the article lists all 15 awards, the total project cost, the federal funds received, and the state. It doesn't go into all the detail there, but you can see the ones that have been mentioned thus far. The QSH Parent Holdco, that's the Alaska one that we heard about, and then of course the Kansas Department of Commerce one, as well as the Iowa one involving Mid-American Energy Company. And Josh, we'll look forward to you enlightening us about the ones you were involved with here. But so the question is, at the headline level, the $930 million that have been funded empowers twice that, 1.77 billion. And so that's as I think the number math here is, we're basically looking at a nearly 50% match, right? And so what is this saying, right? This is higher than we've seen before, right? And so I'd love your thoughts on is this a foretaste of BEAD and the match levels we're going to see with those? That's one question. And the second question is this open access provision, right? I mean, and there's precedent for this in the BTOP funding of 12, 13 years ago. There was a similar requirement of open access for middle mile. I mean, almost all those were middle mile. Again, same question is, was this an easy thing? You've already, Mark, hinted that there were some not easy things with it, but how do you slice that issue of fairness to, of course, the public through the funding, but also to the private providers that are doing this? So who wants to tackle those two questions? Let's start with Josh.
I'd love to just take a crack at the first part of this. The last time the federal government put a lot of money into middle mile infrastructure was during the Broadband Technologies Opportunity Program after the last recession. So it's been a decade. And one of the things that should jump off the page as we look at these awards is that match levels were really high. And the conditions that created the opportunity to have high match levels are twofold. One is it was a really competitive program, right? Lots of applications for a relatively very small amount of money. And the fruit is relatively low on the tree. In other words, there's right easily at hand a lot of projects that with a bit of subsidy can go. If you look at the last mile projects to come, we're way downstream from many, many, many rounds of various federal programs going after subsidizing broadband in places where there weren't a direct economic case. And so I don't necessarily think that the middle mile, like the richness of the middle mile match that has shown up, is telegraphing what's coming in BEAD, because BEAD is a program that is following many, 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 many rounds of last mile financial support. And so the projects that are left are in areas that are relatively less economic than some of the middle mile programs, which, while they might not have happened but for this program, the business case wasn't quite as far out of reach as ones that are coming very late in the broadband financial support cycle.
Good point. Matt, Brent.
Well, so kind of on the tail end of that, I think that the scale of projects that we'll see as far as middle mile is going to be a lot bigger, right? These are not, $5 to $10 million projects. We're looking at, I think what the biggest award was, $60 or $70 million. So I think it's kind of expected that you might need a lot.
88 million was the federal funds, and it was 100. Well, that's the largest awardee. Which
right. So I was saying
187 million was the largest total project cost. These are monster awards, right?
And so I think that they'd be a little expected to have a larger match to kind of prove your financial ability to manage that kind of a project. But to go back to the open access question, I think that, for us, I mean, we're by nature an open access company. A lot of middle mile providers are, because what we do is we enable connectivity, to cell towers, to last mile providers, and that's what we're doing. We're getting them back to a data center somewhere. And so, to me, I think it was a pretty easy thing to overcome, because that's what we did on a day-to-day basis. So saying that we're open access is just a different terminology. You just kind of had to get people over the hump of understanding that it's what we do today. It's just a different word. So,
no, great perspective. Great perspective. That it may not be an issue for wholesale providers, middle mile open access providers.
I'll chime in if I may. So you get what you measure, right? Is a kind of old meme, and this is the first in my experience only program where you had scoring favoritism for the amount of match. When you look at BEAD, it's a 25% minimum. And as I said earlier, what happens is if you offer larger, it's kind of a tiebreaker. If your scores are close or equal, the amount of match is a tiebreaker, but it's not a fundamental element of the scoring in the way that it was here. And so I actually tried hard to convince 2 of these 3 projects who came in at 41% that their chances would be much better at 50. And for Mid-American Energy, they were there. They wanted the network. They had the cash. I got them the in-kind valuation. But for the upcoming BEAD, I agree totally with Josh that the financial calculations for unserved communities where that money is focused are tight, and the 25% will even be a challenge. So in Arizona, the governor asked for 50 million in state capacity for matching funds support, and she got 23.6 million. Governor Katie Hobbs through a Republican legislature, and 5 million for an E-rate leverage fund as well. And I've talked to the Arizona Department of Commerce. Their theory is that projects that will have trouble at the 25% level, now Arizona may get 800 million, maybe 600 becomes competitive, and 200 middle mile, just rough numbers. But that means at 600 million competitive, you need 150 million minimum match on the projects that are proposed. The government is prepared to select projects, unknown criteria, but put 23.6 million into that. So I don't see the big matches because of the economics of the project and the lack of grading for that. I would like to see BEAD require the new middle mile components that, as you correctly mentioned, can be bundled with last mile, require open access criteria. I actually did design a last mile open access project.
That's one piece. That's not what I want.
Please make sure you're muted. If you're, I muted that person, so make sure you're muted. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, NTIA had an earlier program of infrastructure grants, a one-off. I think it was 388 million. And in Alaska, we proposed an open access last mile wireless when wireless was still not as out of favor as it is now, fixed wireless access, where we would bring an anchor ISP committed to serving the communities, but allow multiple ISPs to utilize the network at a wholesale rate, have their own customers. I think the municipal models under BEAD could well be that, but the ISP-driven models are likely to remain proprietary for last mile.
Brent, do you want to weigh in on this point?
Well, I completely agree with the other panelists. I think that as we think about BEAD and the provisions in BEAD that essentially require states to bring all the unserved areas to having served status, means that those are naturally the hardest to reach places that have not yet received any sort of support for build out yet. And so I think for that reason alone, and the need to get to 100% coverage, a lot of those last mile projects are going to struggle to get to 25%, just 25%, much less more than that.
We've got a question from Dan Smith that relates, and he asks, last mile after the 25% is by formula, so no need to offer more, correct? Now, I'm going to answer that first, but I'd love any corrections from anyone. States are going to determine how this works in their state. It's a state broadband office determination. NTIA has set a floor of 25%, but states can set a higher one. Now, whether anyone is going to set a higher one, I don't know, right? And I don't know whether there's a means to score it higher. Mark or Josh, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's unlikely that many, if any states will set a higher threshold. I think like Arizona, and it does allow, I believe, for leftover ARRA and other CARES funding, which is unusual, federal funds, to be allocated also to matches if communities have leftover funds. I may be incorrect, but I believe those leftover funds, even though they're federal funds, can be applied towards the match under the BEAD program. But I don't see people driving to higher match thresholds.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, that those other funds can be reallocated. I would just say the way to think about the federal requirements acting on the states is they represent sort of minimums. And so states can and will impose their own flavors on how to shape the weightings of the various criteria to make selections. And so while they may have certain minimum federal criteria that they'll need to hit across a number of dimensions, I think it's really important for applicants to carefully look at what the states are telling them through their local broadband offices about what's important to them, and make sure that the programs they bring forward not only are sensitive to the federal minimums, but then achieve and overachieve on a competitive basis on the things the states really care about.
I made a post about this event in the broadband community at broadband.io. This is part of the efforts with broadband.money, sponsored broadband breakfast. And Mike Dunn, in response, asked a question: will state entities that were awarded middle mile grants, for example, Kansas, okay, Brent, California, Nevada, mandate BEAD subgrantees utilize, where available, the open access fiber funded by the middle mile dollars? Brent, do you want to tackle that question first?
I don't know that it will be mandated, but I think it will certainly be made to be very attractive.
Can you elaborate?
Well, I think already the construction of this network that was funded brings new transport capacity to communities that have really only had, one option or very limited options in the past. So I don't know. I really can't speak for Jade and the Kansas Broadband Office on what she plans to do with regard to for scoring, but I certainly think that the utilization of that built network certainly at a minimum presents options for those communities that have never had them before, and it's probably anyway going to be the most cost effective in those communities anyway, because of the distance to some of the other transport fiber in the state.
I think Brent's really onto something here on this idea that, look, if there wasn't for a problem in getting to those places either at all or cost effectively, then there wouldn't have been a great case for those middle mile grants in the first place. And so that then provides some gravity. I would just caution that neither networks are built yet, and they may be built by different parties on different timelines. And so I think states are going to be a little reluctant to directly link, because you could imagine a grantee downstream of a state BEAD grant on the last mile saying, I want to turn on my network. You said I had to use this other network. It's not done yet. So, I think there'll be some level of decoupling, but the NTIA was savvy in the sense that they provided certainty and awards to give these projects a head start. And so that ought to create some good gravity for synergy there. But I think on a strict linkage basis, states will have to be really cautious about making sure that sort of optimization to leverage these other federal funds doesn't interfere with like practical feasibility on the ground.
Josh, which projects was Tilson involved in of these 35 awardees? If
So
you're
so we can't talk about all of them, but we can share that we're really proud of the team in Maine that pulled together the MooseNet grant application. So in this case, the Maine Connectivity Authority was the applicant, but like many things in the Maine broadband world, the stakeholders work in a highly collaborative way. And so, Jeff Letourneau at the university system and, that worked really closely with the staff of the authority, and many of the carriers showed up and provided really useful input. There was a really broad cross-section of stakeholders who, really showed up to come up with a plan that, in many states, there was like some competitive tension, right? You had like the state government showing up, you had power companies showing up, you had companies showing up. In Maine, kind of everybody showed up together through the authority, and that was super effective.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, comment on that. No, I don't see it as simply being a requirement. In Arizona, for example, the only middle mile grant was in one of our 15 counties in the southwest corner. However, the state has already invested $150 million of CARES funding in the Department of Transportation, building open access middle mile. They've had an RFI and now RFP for a public-private partner to manage that portfolio. And when I was talking about the $800 million in possible BEAD funding, I said, well, maybe $200 million for internal new middle mile. The state has become themselves an open access middle mile provider outside of this program. And KPMG did a study for Arizona a year and a half ago that strategized and prioritized the places that they thought, with lots of input, that fiber investment should be tiered and go. But even there, I don't see it as a requirement. I see it as an enabler.
What could we just get clarity? A slightly different question, but related. What percentage of I don't know how we measure it. What percentage of these networks must be open access, right? And because the question is prompted by Mark here saying that I think you said 1,300 and you gave a number there. You want to repeat that number there that you had?
In Iowa, or
yeah, in Iowa,
100% of these middle mile programs, and we brought in existing mileage. You're right, and that has to be the 1,300 miles in Iowa of existing network now brought to market. 100% of that has 24 dedicated strands for dark fiber leasing to all comers.
Okay. No, thanks for the clarifying my mistake there. So the other thing I noticed when looking at this list of 35 entities is that it seems to be a kind of a rough mix of half of these 35 are private companies and the other half kind of split among government entities, utilities, cooperatives, other economic development, quasi-public entities, a tribe. And just listening to the four of you speak about these proposals, there are obviously multiple layers of consortia and efforts. Brent, you referred to, I think you called it sort of three parties, and I'm presuming, just to clarify, the state of Kansas, Connected Nation, and was it Idea Tech? Could you just elaborate on that, Brent? And I'd love any of your comments on how this is going to work with so many different parties in a partnership on these projects. So Brent, you first.
Yeah, sure. So in Kansas, it's the state of Kansas, which is comprised of the Department of Transportation, the Department of Commerce, and CanRen, the state research and education network. Idea Tech is the private provider based out of Hutchinson, Kansas. They're both a last mile and transport provider, and then us. So the state, Idea Tech, and us, and essentially the three respective entities have their own roles. Our role at Connected Nation is to administer the open access microducts, the manholes and the handholds along the entire route, right? So if you want access to those microducts, if you want access to a particular manhole or handhole in a certain area, then you come to us. Whereas IdeaTech is managing one microduct with fiber, dark fiber in that duct along the entire route that they will essentially offer to the marketplace. And then the state will have access to two microducts that they will use for their own purposes, both for transportation, for CANREN, and for some other purposes that they have in mind. So from an open access standpoint, as it pertains to last mile ISPs, perhaps that want to buy transport or build transport fiber capacity in a certain area, they would come to either us or IdeaTech based on what's best for them.
You had a figure earlier in your remark about 14 states. I think you said have, is it no carrier neutral facilities? Could you elaborate on that, Brent?
Yeah, no carrier neutral facilities with an internet exchange in them, meaning an IX Ethernet switch facilitating peering in those facilities. So essentially there are 57 large metropolitan markets in the US where internet exchanges exist, and 14 states essentially backhaul their traffic to one of those 57 metro markets to be exchanged with other networks. And so as we think about localizing cloud and content closer to end users, as we think about creating marketplaces for IP transit and transport competition, these types of facilities are going to be needed in a lot of places, not just in the big metros. And so that's why we like working with regional public universities that have in and of themselves a lot of eyeball traffic, right? They are naturally attractive to the cloud and content companies because of the eyeball traffic on campus. And they're often also the regional economic development engines for these regions of states. So we're going to continue to pursue those relationships with public universities to go do this. We have 125 actually identified locations. Some are, of course, priorities over others. I'll share very quickly the map of where we want to go. And of course, there are priorities on this map over others. But most of the blue dots that you see here on this map are locations where a public university exists, and yet the state and that region has no neutral facility at all.
Well, this has been a very meaty discussion. We've flown by here. Let's go ahead and give each of our four panelists an opportunity to offer any closing thoughts or maybe questions that we haven't answered that you'd like answered in a future Broadband Breakfast Live online discussion. So let's go in the same order we started in. Josh, what are some of your thoughts reflecting on what these awards mean and what's next in the broadband rollout?
So I think everybody will be watching closely what happens with these awardees as they unfold. And so I'll just sort of focus on where these awardees are not. There's sort of two broad categories. With the notable exception of Zayo, you don't see a lot of large national telecom players here in the mix, and they will be significant investors in middle mile infrastructure here to come. And so I think that's an area for us to watch very closely. And then the other group that I don't see here is this emerging cohort of public-private partnerships that Mark alluded to with an upcoming solicitation in Arizona, is this idea that state highway departments and turnpike commissions can leverage their right-of-way for places where you can have really high quality middle mile networks with very straight lines that can support a lot of capacity. And so we're involved in one of these in Pennsylvania and another one in North Carolina. We see Arizona's already well into its solicitation cycle. There's discussions of Georgia releasing an RFP soon in this regard. And so I think this activity, this sort of groundswell at the sort of how do we use our highways better, maybe was a little early for this program, but I would watch it carefully as an emerging area where we can solve a lot of middle mile problems leveraging a public asset, but with private money involved.
It almost forces me to just mention something that a piece we posted on Broadband Breakfast about Utah's Department of Transportation, the way they've really leveraged their rights of way in a kind of a fiber swap. And we've reported on this multiple times, but a great discussion of the Department of Transportation. And I noticed that as well. I believe in Kansas, you mentioned the Department of Transportation there, Brent. So Matt, again, hopefully there'll be some other opportunities here. Tell us what you'd like to see and your thoughts on this program, and then we'll get the last word to Brent.
Sure. So I think that, really what I'd like to see is kind of, what Josh just mentioned, is that there are some entities that have been left out that we didn't see them represented. And then we heard kind of difference between the way Maine came together and kind of everybody was at the table. Everybody wanted to make the project work, but then you have in other states where they're kind of combating against each other to get their project funded. But I think it's more important that it is kind of a partnership for everybody because, construction cost is so high. And then we have only a limited amount of government funding that's coming out for this. It's a lot, but it's going to go pretty fast once you start building networks. And, I think that it kind of increased cooperation, when you do have those regional partnerships coming together, you got to make sure that you engage everybody that you can. DOT is very important. Like I said, those right of ways are very good places for us to be. We build there all the time. And so I think that's a really big piece, but also, I think it's important to kind of, bring in the differentiator between middle mile and last mile when you look at the BEAD funding, because if you have a great last mile project, but you have, an extensive amount of middle mile, all that's doing is increasing your per passing cost. And so it's kind of going to skew your scoring system there, which is going to make it harder for some areas to get funding because they do have a bigger piece of middle mile to build, but they're just as unserved as somebody else. So.
Mark, do you want to just quickly weigh in before we get the last word to Brent?
Yeah, for my last word, I really want to build on Josh's thunder. I think he's right on that the next wave of middle mile in my mind is we will see, if we get to see them, the state speed plans, I believe, are due December 27th based on the 180-day shot clock from the June 30th announcement. And then there's a challenge period, and some may have theirs done earlier. But I really do believe, let's say in Arizona, 800 million, it might be 200 million dedicated to new middle mile under ADOT control and an open access model. And so I really do see, not in every state, maybe not even the majority of them, but strategic decisions being made with the BEAD funding once known and splitting it between state-owned or funded middle mile and competitive grant programs.
All right. Brent, final thoughts.
Yeah, so I think that a focus on network interconnection is going to become even more important among these programs in the future. How do we bring wholesale internet costs, IP transit costs down in regions in order to make last mile services more affordable? Because a lot of these local ISPs are paying significant prices for transport to get to an IXP in another city, only to then pay additional costs for wholesale access from a provider like Aurelion or Hurricane Electric. And we've got to bring those wholesale companies closer to these regional communities. We actually did that in a project in Iowa. I won't take time to talk about it right now, but essentially we brought the cost of IP transit down from about $3.85 in Eastern Iowa to 35 cents a megabit for a consortium of school districts there by creating a place where IP transit providers could actually serve those customers. The last thing I want to mention too is I think we all should be monitoring the progress of HR 3565, the Spectrum Auctions Reauthorization Act, which is passed out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, as I understand it, and includes a provision where 30% of future auction proceeds would actually be dumped into NTIA's middle mile grant program, which would enable other middle mile build out down the road. And it's authorized up to $5 billion. So many of those unawarded applications that we saw. I think Mark, you mentioned there was, the oversubscription rate. I think it was $7.47 billion worth of applications for $1 billion in funding. Well, this would be a way to get money into the middle mile program without actually requiring an appropriation from Congress, which could be very attractive on a bipartisan basis. And that bill, HR 3565, is co-sponsored by both the chair of the committee and the ranking member of the committee. So it's got bipartisan support. So I think that's something we should all watch closely.
Well, this has been, again, a great discussion. Really appreciate each of you making the time, not only for our panelists, but for those who've attended. Don't forget to sign up for the Made in America Summit on Tuesday, June 27th. The following day, we'll be back with our Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We're going to be talking about the future of ultra high-speed broadband. On behalf of our great panelists, Josh Broder, Mark Goldstein, Matt Leach of FiberLight, and Brent Legg. I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you on Tuesday, June 27th.